Chapter 1: Humanity, Society, and War. War is waged by men, not by beasts or by gods. It is a peculiarly human activity. To call it a crime against mankind is to miss at least half its significance. It is also the punishment of a crime. Frederick Manning, The Middle Parts of Fortune. If you visit the lovely alpine town of Bolzano, you will often see long queues outside the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology. People wait patiently, many with their children, to see one of Bolzano's main attractions, the mummified body of a man who lived around 3300 BC. Otzi the Iceman died before the pyramids or Stonehenge had been built. Yet the eyes kept his body and possessions intact until he was found by two hikers in 1991. He wore a cloak made from woven grass and clothes, including leggings, boots, and a cap made from leather. His last meals, still in his stomach, were dried meat, roots, fruits, and possibly bread. He was carrying wooden baskets and various tools, including an axe with a copper head, a knife, arrows, and parts of a bow. It was assumed at first that he had lost his path in a snowstorm and died alone, to be left undisturbed for the next 5 millennia. It was a sad story of an innocent farmer or shepherd. In the next decades, however, thanks to advances in medicine and science, it became possible to examine the body more closely with CT scans, X-rays, and biochemical testing. Otzi had an arrowhead embedded in one shoulder, and his body was bruised and cut. His head had apparently been hit too. It is most likely that he died of the wounds he received from his attacker or attackers, and it is possible that he had at some point killed others. Judging by the blood found on his knife and an arrowhead, Otzi is by no means the only piece of evidence we have that early humans, certainly by the time of the later Stone Age, made weapons, ganged up on each other, and did their best to finish each other off. Graves dating back to Otzi's time and earlier have been found across the globe, from the Middle East to the Americas and the Pacific, containing piles of skeletons which bear the marks of violent death. Although weapons made of wood and skins generally do not survive, archaeologists have discovered stone blades, some still buried in the skeleton. Violence seems to have been present even earlier during much of the greatest part of our human story. In fact, when our ancestors lived nomadic lives, foraging for edible plants and killing other creatures for food, much of what is known is naturally highly speculative. Collecting and reading evidence, especially the further into the past you go and humans appeared on Earth, some 350,000 years ago, is extraordinarily difficult, but we are gradually accumulating more, thanks to archaeological discoveries and scientific advances, such as the reading of ancient DNA. Until very recently, in humanity's long history, we now know we organized ourselves into small bands scattered across the more temperate parts of the globe. There was not much in the way of material goods to fight about, and presumably, if a band came under threat from others, it could simply move away. For much of the 20th century, those who studied the origins of human society tended to assume that the early nomadic bands lived a peaceful existence. Yet archaeologists have also discovered skeletons from this long, distant period, whose injuries suggest otherwise. Anthropologists have tried to get at what that world was like by looking at the few hunter and forager societies that survived until the modern age. It is a roundabout path with potential pitfalls. Outsiders who observe such societies bring their own preconceptions, and contact itself brings changes. Having said that, there are some suggestive findings. In 1803, for example, a 13-year-old boy, William Buckley, escaped from an English penal colony in Australia and found refuge among the Aborigines for the next 3 decades. He later described a world where raids, ambushes, long-running feuds, and sudden and violent death were part of the fabric of society. At the other end of the world, in the harsh Arctic landscape, the first explorers and anthropologists found that the local inhabitants, Inuit and Inupiat among them, made weapons, including armor from bone and ivory, and had a rich oral tradition of stories of past wars. In 1964, Napoleon Chagnon, a young American anthropology student, went to do fieldwork among the Yanomami people in the Brazilian rainforest. He expected that they would confirm the then prevailing view of hunter-foragers as essentially peaceable. He found that within each village, the Yanomami lived for the most part in harmony and were gentle and kind with each other, but that it was a different matter when it came to dealing with other villages. Then differences were settled with clubs and spears, and one village would raid another to kill the men and children and abduct the women. In his 30 years of observations, he concluded that a quarter of Yanomami men died as a result of violence. While there are heated exchanges, wars indeed, of words and ideas, between historians, anthropologists, and sociobiologists, the evidence seems to be on the side of those who say that human beings, as far back as we can tell, have had a propensity to attack each other in organized ways. In other words, to make war. That challenges us to understand why it is that human beings are willing and able to kill each other. It is more than an intellectual puzzle. If we do not understand why we fight, we have little hope of avoiding future conflicts. So far, there are many theories, but no agreed answers. Perhaps war is the result of greed or competition for dwindling resources, for food, territory, sexual partners, or slaves. Or are we shaped by biological ties and shared culture to value our own groups, whether clans or nations, and fear others, like our cousins, the chimpanzees? Do we instinctively lash out when we feel threatened? Is war something we cannot help doing, or is it something we have constructed through ideas or culture? Since war and the fear of war are still very much with use in the 21st century, the answers to such questions matter. War would not be possible without our willingness to kill, but that alone does not define it. We would not describe 2 men fighting in a bar, or even a dozen or so gang members battling in a street or a park as making war. Violence leading to injury or death is part of war, but we tend to see that as a tool of war, not as an end in itself. The great German theorist Karl von Clausewitz, in one of his most famous observations, said, "War is an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will." War has a purpose, whether it is offensive or defensive. As with individuals or gangs fighting, war can be about honor, survival, or control. But it is distinguished from a bar fight by its scale and its organization. War involves dozens, hundreds, thousands, even millions, rather than one or a few people committing violence on each other. It is a clash between 2 organized societies which command the adherence of their members and have existed over considerable time, usually in their own territory. As Hedley Bull, the English political theorist, put it, "Violence is not war unless it is carried out in the name of a political unit." And he went on equally, "Violence carried out in the name of a political unit is not war unless it is directed against another political unit. Gangs are organized, and their members can claim to share values and goals, but they are not stable political and social units. They might, of course, become so and grow in size and in time become clans, true tribes, chiefdoms, baronies, kingdoms, or nations which are capable of engaging in war. One of the many paradoxes of war is that humans got good at it when they created organized societies. Indeed, the two developments have evolved together. War organized, purposeful violence between two political units became more elaborate when we developed organized sedentary societies, and it helped to make those societies more organized and powerful. It was only 10,000 years ago, an instant in the much longer human story, when some of us started to settle down and become farmers. That war became more systematic and started to need special training and a warrior class. Along with graves in different parts of the world, archaeologists have found evidence of fortifications in Turkey, for example, which date back to at least 6,000 BC, and of clusters of dwellings, which appear to have been burned down deliberately. With the advent of agriculture, humans were more tied to one place and had more worth stealing and worth defending. And to defend themselves, they needed better organization and more resources, which in turn led to groups expanding their territory and growing their populations, either peacefully or through conquest. Among the many debates over the origins and evolution of war is whether humans have been getting more violent or less. Steven Pinker and others who think like him, such as the archaeologist Ian Morris, are on the optimistic side and believe there is a clear trend away from violence. Most countries no longer have public executions. They have laws against cruelty to animals or children, and sports, such as bear baiting or dogfighting, are normally illegal. The optimists go further and attempt to tot up deaths from war in the past. Not in itself an easy task to argue that homicide rates in the past were far higher than they are today, and that deaths in war as a proportion of humans alive at the time are fewer in the 20th and 21st centuries, even allowing for the great bloodlettings of the two world wars than in earlier wars. Others challenge the figures and also point out that war deaths in the 20th century may amount to 75% of all war deaths in the last 5,000 years. And if you really want to be depressed about the prospects for humanity, studies the using mathematical tools at the University of Florence and the University of Colorado claim to show that the trend is for fewer but more deadly wars. Their argument is that the more interconnected societies become, the quicker a conflict can spread along the paths of the network, just as computer viruses or forest fires do. A small squabble in the Balkans in the summer of 1914 grew into the Great War because Europe's powers were so interlinked by treaties, understandings, or plans that tensions spread upward and outward from the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo until a general war exploded. Even if Pinker is right and the debate goes on, it somehow does not seem very reassuring. Those of us who have enjoyed the long peace since 1945 need to reflect that much of the world, including Indochina, Afghanistan, the Great Lakes District in Africa, and large parts of the Middle East, has seen and still sees conflict. A long-running project at Uppsala University in Sweden estimates that between 1989 and 2017, over 2 million people died as a result of war. Since 1945, perhaps 52 million have been forced to flee because of conflict. The prevalence of violence and war in the past, and their persistence in the present, raised the awkward question as to whether humans are genetically programmed to fight each other. One avenue of research has been to look at our closest relatives in the animal kingdom, the chimpanzees and the bonobos. Both live in organized groups, have ways of communicating with each other, and make primitive tools. In Northern Ireland, a pair of enterprising chimpanzees recently worked together to escape from Belfast Zoo by making a ladder out of a branch. Chimpanzees and bonobos are so alike in appearance that until the 1920s, it was assumed that they were the same species. In fact, they have evolved to be quite different in the ways they live together and deal with strangers. Jane Goodall studied chimpanzees in their natural habitat in Tanzania for over half a century. She and her teams of colleagues became so much part of the scenery that the chimpanzees grew to ignore their presence. The observers watched as the chimpanzees developed relationships, cared for their young, engaged in play, and killed each other. Male-dominated groups, each fiercely attached to its own territory, waged organized conflict against other chimpanzee groups, often without being provoked. They killed lone chimpanzees who strayed too far out of their own territory, and they carried out raids, killing rival males as well as females and infants. In a particular long-running conflict, one group exterminated another and occupied its territory. In her memoir, Goodall said that at first she thought the chimpanzees in her study were, for the most part, rather nicer than human beings. Then she went on, "Suddenly we found that chimpanzees could be brutal, that they, like us, had a darker side to their nature. Before we settle on human beings having an indelible dark stain on their natures, we should look at the counter-example of the bonobos, who do not fight or hunt each other. Bonobos seem as intelligent as their chimpanzee cousins, but they have evolved very differently, possibly because they live on the south side of the Congo River, where foraging is easy, and they do not have more powerful rivals, gorillas in particular, as the Tanzanian chimpanzees do. Among the bonobos, females rather than males form strong groups, and they tend to dominate the males. When strange bonobos meet, their first instinct is not to attack, but to tentatively gaze and then move slowly toward each other. They start to share food, groom each other, and embrace indiscriminately, giving each other a variety of pleasures. Videos of bonobos at play are very popular on the internet, even if some would think them not suitable for family viewing. Whether the bonobo preference for making love and not war is the result of environment or evolution, or a mix of the two, is still being debated. Which set of our cousins do humans most resemble? The answer seems to be both. We cannot deny the relationship. Humans share some 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees and bonobos. Unlike them, however, we have developed language, elaborate technologies, and an ability to think in abstract terms. We have built highly complex societies with social and political institutions, ideas, belief systems, and values. We are certainly capable, like the chimpanzees, of reacting violently when we are fearful. But like the bonobos, we have a highly developed capacity for friendly interaction, cooperation, trust, and altruism. In his The Goodness Paradox, the anthropologist Richard Wrangham argues that over the long course of human evolution, we have learned to tame our aggressive side, partly by domesticating ourselves as we have domesticated wild animals. Think of how wolves eventually became our trusted pet dogs. He believes that humans, working together, gradually got rid of the more violent members of their groups by killing them. Perhaps, as other anthropologists have suggested, sexual preference played a role too, as women and their parents looked for peaceable, cooperative mates. While this gradual domestication of our ancestors was happening, humans, Wrangham continues, were also building social and political institutions, including strong central governments, which had a monopoly on violence. So their subjects, unlike the chimpanzees, could no longer maim and kill at will. Yet, that did not mean an end to violence. Rather, organized societies could now use it in an organized and purposive way. The paradox, as Professor Wrangham sees it, is that as humans became nicer, they also got better at killing, and on an ever larger scale. We cannot deny, I think, the inheritance evolution has left us. We have impulses, feelings, including fear and needs, and desires for things such as food and sex. Like most species, from birds to mammals, we have a strong attachment to territory. But we are also sentient beings, and we have the capacity to make decisions, to listen to the better angels of our natures, or the worse. We have created cultures which in turn shape who we are, and help to determine what we think is important. So we do not fight just for survival, food, sex, shelter, but also for abstractions such as religions or nations, which we think worth killing and dying for. Nor do we invariably fight, no matter how important the cause may be, to us. We also look for peaceful solutions. Indeed, humans have dreamed, and still do, of ridding the world of war altogether. The jury is still out on how and why we evolved as we did, and how much it matters when it comes to war. Another equally heated and long-running discussion is whether society itself makes us better or worse, more peaceful or more warlike. Instead of contrasting chimpanzees and bonobos, this debate revolves around two 18th-century European thinkers, Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Both grappled with the relationship between human beings and their societies, and whether war or peace was our normal condition. Both described humans in a state of nature before organized societies appeared on the scene. Unlike us, they had no evidence of how humans had lived in the distant past. Rather, they found it useful to imagine how humans might coexist with each other without rules or organizations, and then look at their own societies. Rousseau argued that violence was not an integral part of being human. Human beings, he held, were naturally good until society made them corrupt. He described a pastoral idyll where hunter-foragers lived in harmony with each other and with nature. They had sufficient sustenance for their needs and had no need to fight, either to take food from others or to defend what they had. Evil crept in when humans settled down and started to farm. That led, Rousseau argued, to the development of private property and specialized trades. As some remained farmers while others became craftsmen, warriors, or rulers, the successful accumulated more property, so that society, which had once been egalitarian, became unequal and hierarchical. The weak were exploited by the strong, and society came to be marked by greed, selfishness, and violence. As society and states evolved and became more complex, with greater powers over their members, humans had less and less freedom. Since separate states tended to think only of their own interests, they were more likely to go to war with each other than not. Rousseau's solution, which he laid out in the social contract, was not to go back to his putative paradise, which he accepted would be impossible, but to create a new relationship between individuals and their social and political institutions. Humans need to live and work together, but they should be able to do so willingly in a state that works for them, and not the other way around, and one that guarantees them freedom. If humans can behave as though they have entered freely into a contract with each other, both individuals and society will become happier and more harmonious. Once that has been achieved, states by now enlightened can work together to overcome the mutual fears, suspicions, and greed which have so often led to war. At times, Rousseau seems to have been imagining a federated states of Europe whose members would outlaw war and ensure peace. Hobbes painted a very different picture. In his state of nature, humans lived precariously and struggled against each other to survive. Life, as he said, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. There was no time, and there were no resources left over for making tools, cultivating crops, trade, or learning. No knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society. And which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. Far from the growth of settled societies and large states leading to conflict, the opposite was more the case. The growth of a big and powerful polity, what Hobbes called Leviathan, offered the way to bring violence under control, at least within societies. International society remained much like the state of nature, with states jostling for advantage. In an anarchical world, the strong ones bullied the weak, and the weak capitulated or were subjugated by force. Unlike Rousseau, he had no expectations that societies and states could become more enlightened and learn to work with each other voluntarily. Many of us still prefer the Rousseau version of the past and the assumption that humans are by nature innocent and peaceful. The 20th century was so awful in so many ways that it is not surprising that we keep searching for contemporary societies which are better and gentler than ours. If they are not hidden away on tropical islands or in rainforests or deserts, perhaps they can be created based on the right sorts of principles. For a time in the 1920s and 1930s, Western intellectuals thought they had found their Garden of Eden in the Soviet Union, until at last, the evidence of mass starvation and organized murder inflicted by the state became too obvious for most to ignore. In the 1960s, Mao's China became the great hope, partly because so little was known about it. The Cultural Revolution seemed benign at first. With the high-spirited young remaking society into an egalitarian paradise where everyone worked happily to build a new world again. The rosy picture changed and grew much darker. as we learned about the real brutality and the destructiveness of those years. From the Garden of Eden in the Bible onward, literature and the arts have portrayed peaceful, golden ages of the past or utopias to come. Greek and Roman poets, such as Hesiod or Seneca, believed that humans had enjoyed a golden age in the distant past, and that history was heading ever downward toward the Bronze and the Iron Ages when men acquired weapons and became greedy and warlike. Similar stories exist in Indian and Chinese traditions. Early explorers who encountered peoples in the Americas or the Pacific were struck by how peaceable many of them seemed to be. Their reports caught the imagination of a rapidly industrializing West. In the 19th century, Western artists such as Henri Rousseau and Paul Gauguin painted dreamlike scenes of beautiful Africans or Pacific Islanders surrounded by fruit ready to fall from the tree. There was apparently no willingness to fight and no need. When anthropology appeared as a serious field of research in the 19th and 20th centuries, its findings largely appeared to confirm such a happy picture. The American Margaret Mead, who did her fieldwork in Samoa in the 1920s, painted a world where there was no guilt, greed, or anger, and no war, the curse of other civilizations. No one in Samoa, she wrote, suffers for his convictions or fights to the death for special ends. Young people easily followed their elders into loving, open sexual relationships, and families feasted together as a matter of course, sharing their plentiful food with each other. Sometimes sleep will not descend upon the village until long past midnight. Then at last, there is only the mellow thunder of the reef and the whisper of lovers as the village rests until dawn. Her book, Coming of Age in Samoa, had a huge impact, especially in the 1960s when it seemed to point the way to a world with no more Vietnams and unlimited and guilt-free love. More recently, both her research and her conclusions have come into question. Mead's later critics pointed out that she did not speak the local language well, was only in Samoa for a few months, and perhaps most damning of all, was prepared to believe uncritically everything the locals told her. A couple of them later said they had lied to her about Samoan teenagers' uncomplicated, guilt-free sex lives. Earlier, visitors to Samoa, such as missionaries and sailors, had described Samoans rather as busily engaged in fighting each other. It was only with the coming of imperialism, in this case in the shape of the Americans and the Germans, then later the British, that peace came to Samoa. For a time, we thought that Mayan civilization in Mesoamerica might provide a heartening example of how states could live in harmony with each other. Regrettably, the deciphering of the Mayan script after the Second World War shows that the surviving literature is largely about war. So the Rousseauian version of human history, or the Hobbesian, the archaeological and historical evidence points firmly toward Hobbes. With war as a long-standing and integral part of human experience, that does not mean that we should not hope for a future more like Rousseau's. In the meantime, perhaps it can be some consolation that war, surprisingly, has brought peace and progress for societies. That brings me to a second paradox of war, that growing state power and the emergence of bigger states, what Hobbes called Leviathan, are often the result of war, but that in turn can produce peace. The power of the state and its institutions is based on the perceived authority of the rulers, whether that comes from the gods or from the voters, and on the acquiescence of those who are ruled over. But somewhere crucially in the mix is war, or the threat of the violence that the state can exert both over its own people and against its enemies. The emergence of state-run police forces in much of the Western world and parts of Asia in the 19th century gradually put an end to banditry and low-level violence. The power of feudal lords in Europe was broken when monarchs acquired sufficient force to destroy their private armies and level their castles. The emergence of the strong state went hand in hand with its increasing monopoly over the use of force and violence within its borders. If you refuse to pay taxes, set your neighbor's house on fire, or ignore the summons to do military service, a strong state will lay hands on you, and often your property as well, and you will be punished and even sometimes executed. The peoples of Yugoslavia lived together peacefully, if not always happily, under Tito's firm rule. Because, as a Croat put it, every 100 yards we had a policeman to make sure we loved each other very much. When Tito died, and his Communist Party fell to pieces, the different ethnicities in Yugoslavia, urged on by unscrupulous demagogues, turned on each other. We may see the state as oppression incarnate, but we should think for a moment what it is like to live where there is no state power. The Samoans and the New Guinea Highlanders once knew that, and the unfortunate people of the failed states of Yemen, Somalia, and Afghanistan know it today. Success in war against external enemies has often been used to further legitimize and enhance the authority of the state. As governments, whether democratically elected or dictatorships, point to great victories as signs of virtue and markers of their accomplishments. In his 2019 State of the Union address, President Donald Trump talked about the American victory after the D-Day landings in Normandy, ignoring the presence of other Allied troops, which he said they did for America and for us. And, he went on, everything that has come since our triumph over communism, our giant leaps of science and discovery, our unrivaled progress toward equality and justice, all of it is possible thanks to the blood and tears and courage and vision of the Americans who came before the Romans, erected columns and victory arches to glorify the emperor and the state. Napoleon used writers and artists to laud his triumphs as he rose to power in France. When he made himself emperor, one of his obsequious senators called him the incomparable hero who has conquered them all, who has plucked everything out of chaos and created another universe for us. As long as he seemed invincible, Napoleon kept his hold over France and much of Europe. Hitler's string of victories won over even German conservatives who had doubted his fitness to rule. Conversely, rulers who cannot defend their own peoples or suffer defeats abroad lose their support in classical China. Emperors who failed to deal with violent revolts within or attacks from outside were said to have lost the mandate of heaven and were therefore no longer fit to rule. Napoleon III, nephew of the great Napoleon, led France to defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. His regime fell and he fled into exile. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, Stalin, so it is said, panicked and said, "Lenin founded our state and we fucked it up." President Lyndon Johnson decided not to run in the 1968 election because of the failure of his government to bring the Vietnam War to an end. States and empires have grown through wars of conquest, or when weaker powers have capitulated to them. Rather than engage in a hopeless one-sided struggle, the Athenians used their navy and their land forces to bring their neighbors under their control. Alexander the Great led his armies to build a vast empire. The Roman legions marched outward from Rome, conquering as they went. China was once divided among some 150 small states, which were gradually consolidated in a painful and bloody process. The Chinese still remember with horror their warring states period from the 5th to the 3rd century BC, when the remaining handful of states fought an endless series of wars, and the people were ground down and impoverished. The Qin emperor, who finally brought the different states under his control in 221 BC, was a ruthless tyrant, but he has been remembered with gratitude as the ruler who brought peace and order to China. He was buried in Xi'an with ranks of terracotta soldiers, a fitting reminder of the role that military force had played in creating his state. Closer to our own times, Prussia, that patchwork collection of territories, used its army to accumulate more and more territory and ultimately to create modern Germany. The Soviet Empire in the Cold War was acquired and held down by the Red Army. Great powers are not necessarily nice ones. Why should they be? But they do provide a minimum of security and stability for their own people. Those powers that last use military force to sustain themselves, but their longevity has rested on providing reasonably effective government, which has helped to win the acquiescence and even loyalty of their peoples. The Romans understood very well that they had used war to create peace for themselves, but that they had other tools worth using too. As Virgil has it in the Aeneid, remember, Roman, it is for you to rule the nations with your power. That will be your skill to crown peace with law, to spare the conquered and subdue the proud power alone, without some support from the people, cannot ensure the survival of leviathans. The Roman Empire lasted as long as it did because it replaced a collection of often quarreling states, and because within people's foods and goods could travel freely along its well-built roads or across the Mediterranean, which had been cleared of pirates. Within the empire, economic prosperity grew and people lived longer. Indeed, foreigners moved into the Roman Empire rather than Romans moving away. Roman subjects were not held down by force, although that threat was always there. Most of the fighting Roman soldiers did was along Rome's frontiers the better. Leviathans have consistent laws, reasonable taxes, and security of property, and sometimes even, as in the Roman Empire, a tolerance of different customs and religions. Strong armed forces build strong states, but they can also undermine them when they get out of control. In the Roman Empire, unscrupulous generals led their loyal troops against the state, or the soldiers themselves sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. When the Emperor Pertinax was assassinated in AD 193 after his 3-month reign, there was a disgraceful scene. According to the historian Dio Cassius, for just as if it had been in some market or auction room, both the city and the entire empire were auctioned off. Over time, leviathans decay, their governments becoming less and less competent, unable to deal with armed revolt from within and enemies along the borders. The Vandals sacked a weakened Rome. The horse-borne Mongol warriors swept away old regimes in Persia, China, India, and Russia. The Ming dynasty was founded in 1368 when rebel armies led by a peasant defeated the last forces of the Mongol Yuan dynasty. 2.5 centuries later, the Manchu poured through a gap in the Great Wall to overthrow the Ming. In turn, Leviathans can also bring peace to their neighborhoods, if they are powerful enough. In the 19th century, the British Empire acted as the world's policeman, ensuring that the world's waterways were secure and conflicts, where possible, were dampened down. The British did this out of their own self-interest to protect their trade and their empire. But the Pax Britannica, like the Roman one before it, made possible the flourishing of trade and commerce and vast movements of peoples around the globe. We may be living through the end of the hegemony of the American Leviathan, and we are starting to realize that the world needs someone or something to maintain order. A less stable substitute is a coalition of powers of roughly equal size and strength that agree to work together to keep the peace. This happened in Europe in the first half of the 19th century with the Concert of Europe and during a brief period with the democracies in the 1920s. It only takes one or two powers, however, such as Germany before the First World War and Germany, Japan, and Italy, before the Second, to decide to challenge the status quo and for peace to tip toward war. The world reverts surprisingly easily to Hobbes' state of anarchy, where no power trusts another. Then the prospect is repeated conflict, just as it is within failed states. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, in the 5th century A.D., Europe gradually reverted to a lower level of development. Trade fell off because the roads and waterways were too dangerous for travelers and learning, and the arts faded. Waves of invaders, Angles, Vandals, Huns, Goths swept through looting and pillaging because there was no force to stop them. Local strongmen, with their castles and their retainers, exploited their subjects and waged war on each other. In the 12th century, a chronicler wrote of how one Robert of Wetteau's will left almost 40 kinsmen, all proud of their knightly status, who were continually at war with one another. Europe has had far fewer periods of unity than China, but it has moved by fits and starts from some 5 independent political units, mainly baronies and principalities in the 15th century, to 500 in the early 17th century, 200 at the time of Napoleon in the early 19th, and fewer than 30 after 1945. That did not bring an end to war, but it did limit the number of potential combatants and therefore the number of likely wars. The growth of European unity with European institutions was consciously conceived as an alternative to the European state system, with all its dangers for conflict and war among its powers. So, it is hoped, has become unthinkable. The need to make war has gone hand in hand with the development of the state. The historian Charles Tilly goes so far as to say, war made the state and the state made war. Protecting yourself from neighbors or raiding nomads takes organization to get the bodies to fight, and then to provide leadership and the discipline and training to exact obedience. Governments need to know how many fighters they can muster, and that leads to counting and to keeping records. The word census comes from ancient Rome. In the 6th century BC, the authorities started to list male citizens, both for collecting taxes and because they were expected to bear arms, while early soldiers often brought their own weapons and food. With larger and longer campaigns, the government had to provide them, and that meant more bureaucrats to count and find the supplies and the animals and the boats to transport them. for the famous Battle of Cannae against the Carthaginians in 216 BC, it has been estimated that the Roman army of some 80,000 figures are always tricky in the ancient world. Would have required about 100 tons of wheat a day for their army. In the 18th century, the British Navy was the single biggest industry by far in the whole of the British Isles. While you could build a cotton mill for £5,000, a large capital ship for the Navy, such as Nelson's Victory, cost over £60,000. To build, staff, and maintain the Navy required shipyards, warehouses, and bases both in the British Isles and overseas, and a growing number of officials, administrators, suppliers, and workers. The Navy needed money, a great deal of it, as well as organization and management, and the British government developed the necessary tools and institutions which then came in handy for managing other aspects of British society. The Treasury was founded in the second half of the 17th century to keep military expenditure under control, but over time developed into a body which kept track of the spending of all government departments. In the 1690s, when Britain was at war with France and desperately needed funds, the government, as an emergency measure, founded the Bank of England, which could take money from subscribers and lend to the government at a fixed rate. Again, like the Treasury, the bank grew into a key part of Britain's fiscal system because the government was able to guarantee regular interest payments. Thanks to its efficiency in collecting taxes, investors found government-issued annuities or bonds, solid and desirable investments. The result was more funding available for such purposes as war. Tacitus, the great Roman historian, said, "Money is the sinew of war." Centuries later, the British diarist Samuel Pepys complained, "Want of money puts all things, and above all things, the navy out of order." In the Peloponnesian War, Athens managed to rebuild its fleet 3 times. But when the last one was destroyed in 405 BC, it had run out of resources and was forced to surrender to Sparta and its allies. Wars sometimes pay for themselves if the defeated enemy has good pickings. Alexander the Great accumulated huge wealth from the Persians in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Spanish financed their European wars largely from the gold and silver they brought back from the defeated Aztec and Inca empires. The German Confederation made France pay a lump sum. After the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, Germany forced Russia to hand over its gold and send natural resources westward in the 1918 Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and the Allies tried to extract reparations for war damage from Germany under the Treaty of Versailles. Often, however, governments need to extract the necessary funds from their own people or borrow from willing lenders until the second half of the 20th century. War constituted by far the largest expenditure for the most powerful states of Europe. In the 9 Years' War of 1688–97 between the France of Louis XIV and Britain, it is estimated that France was spending 74% of its revenue and Britain 75%. Although his armies won repeated victories, Louis was eventually obliged to make an unsatisfactory peace because he could no longer find anyone willing to lend him the money he needed. The British, it turned out, were much better at taxing as well as borrowing and managing their debt. Although France was the richest country in Europe, Louis XIV and his successors never managed to tap into that wealth and this eventually affected France's capacity to wage war. Government borrowing only drove the state toward bankruptcy. In 1789, Louis XIV's grandson, Louis XVI, was forced into taking what became the fatal step of calling an assembly of representatives of the main French classes, in the hope that they would vote for taxes. The British, it is true, found it easier to collect taxes because they could impose customs duties at their ports. More important, however, they had a parliament which was prepared when necessary to raise taxes, and by the 18th century had what was probably the most efficient tax-collecting system in Europe. The public grumbled, but paid up. By the end of the American Revolutionary War in 1783, the average Englishman was paying almost 3 times as much in annual taxes as his French counterpart. What is more, the taxes were collected by a government agency, not, as in France, by tax farmers who bought the rights to raise taxes on the understanding that they could keep whatever extra they raised as long as they gave the government a fixed amount. Dr. Johnson, in his dictionary, may have defined the important excise levied on domestic commodities as a hateful tax collected by wretches. But it was key to Britain keeping its navy afloat and its armies abroad. As the British state became more organized, efficient, and powerful, it was able to strengthen its control over British society, including the rebellious Scots and Irish. The excise commissioners amassed quantities of information, from the number of candle makers to the number of shops. The excise office gave licenses to thousands of brewers, publicans, tea and coffee dealers, and a host of other trades. Its inspectors were everywhere with 10,000 eyes, as people complained that secure annual revenue meant that if the government decided to borrow funds, its lenders could be assured that they would be repaid. Following the earlier Dutch example, the British government developed a system of cheap public credit, borrowing from its own citizens through issuing short-term and longer-term paper instruments, which it systematically paid off. Government often used another new device, the sinking fund, where certain government revenues were assigned to paying off particular debts. Without that steady, reliable pipeline of funds, Britain would not have had the navy to make it a European and world economic and military power in the late 17th and 18th centuries. We remember Pepys for the wonderful human details in his diaries, his descriptions of London, his impatience with his wife and her friends, or his roving eye. But he was also a serious, dedicated bureaucrat who, over many years of painstaking work, transformed the British Navy from an inefficient and corrupt institution into a formidable fighting force. He studied shipbuilding, checked every contract, and knew the price of everything that went into a ship, from the tar to the cannon. He found, he said, great content in it, and hoped to save the king money by this practice. He did much more than that. By the end of his 30 years of service, the Navy had doubled the number of ships and guns, and it was being managed efficiently and honestly. The growth of centralized state power in Europe by the 18th century, with armies and navies that were organized, controlled, and paid for by the state, also meant that governments had at their disposal the means to crack down on the recalcitrant and rebellious, whether these were local magnates, riotous crowds, or brigands. The state's need to maintain its monopoly on force at home and to defend itself from outside enemies has led to its having more control over society, its resources, and the lives of its peoples. In the Middle Ages, both the English and the Scottish governments ordered their subjects to engage in regular archery practice. The Scots were told to give up football as well. In the First and Second World Wars, the governments of countries involved determined what goods factories would produce and what would be rationed. Skilled workers in certain jobs, for example munitions or mining, lost their freedom to change employment or volunteer for the armed forces. Fashion, food, amusements, travel, all were regulated for the sake of the war effort. And military discipline and regimentation creep in even during peacetime. Think of factories with strict times for clocking in and out of the Amazon warehouses of today, or of the way public education in the 19th and early 20th centuries put pupils in uniform and lined them up in orderly rows, and sometimes still does. On the other hand, states have had to bring changes which have benefited parts or the whole of society in order to improve their military capacity. Consistent laws and efficient administration may be a necessary part of mobilizing a nation's resources for war. But they can also enlarge the rights of subjects and the space in which they can operate. Entitlement to the rights of citizenship has repeatedly been tied to military service. In the classical worlds of Greece and Rome, being a citizen meant the obligation to take up arms, which in turn validated citizens' rights. Although citizenship was tied to property in most city-states, among sea powers such as Athens, the need for rowers for galleys meant that free men who possessed little but strength could obtain citizenship by picking up an oar. In the early Roman Republic, when Rome was almost constantly at war with its Italian neighbors, the aristocratic leaders who monopolized power were obliged to call on the ordinary men, the plebeians, to fight. Legend has it that on one occasion, the plebeians withdrew to a place outside Rome and elected their own representatives, the tribunes, and successfully demanded rights, including a veto for their tribunes, over certain decisions of the aristocratic magistrates and the Senate. Countries have often awarded citizenship to foreigners for service in wartime. Until 2018, immigrants to the United States who served in the military had their citizenship applications expedited. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as the capacity for nations to make war on a large scale grew thanks to the Industrial Revolution, governments, even autocratic ones, found themselves making reforms in response to war or in anticipation of it, and to keep public support. Governments encouraged railway building, in part to be able to move troops easily about the country in case of domestic unrest, or to the frontiers for war. Germany got a single time zone in place of the existing patchwork when the military demanded it so that they could move troop trains smoothly. Better education and better nutrition were needed to produce fitter soldiers and sailors. The British government and British public opinion were dismayed to discover that 1 out of 3 volunteers for the South African War of 1899 to 1902 had to be rejected as unfit. That spurred demands for improvements in public health and innovations, such as free school meals for indigent children. After Russia's disastrous defeat in the Crimean War, Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom, partly to reform the conscription system. He tried, with some success, to modernize his country's bureaucracy and justice and education systems. Later generations of Russian reformers advocated for representative institutions, in part as a way of building the nation. As Prince Yevgeny Trubetskoy said before the First World War, it is impossible to govern against the people when it is necessary to turn to it for the defense of Russia. Between 1914 and 1917, the Russian government was to find itself doing just that, governing against the will of many of its own people. War has often opened the way to massive political and social changes. When it weakens government and undermines its legitimacy, victory can entrench a regime in power just as long. Drawn-out wars of attrition can destroy it. Sometimes the change is political, one set of rulers replacing another, but it is often more fundamental. The First World War imposed heavy strains on all the powers engaged, but the stronger ones, Britain and France, and, to a certain extent, Germany, weathered the storms. They underwent change, but did not emerge after 1918 as fundamentally altered societies. Germany, it is true, became a republic, but its institutions, from the bureaucracy to the military, and its culture remained much the same. The experience of Russia before 1914, the most fragile of the great powers, was quite different. The Tsarist regime proved incapable of managing the war and coping with the strains on society. And by 1917, its power had drained away in the face of popular dissatisfaction, increasingly organized opposition, and a growing unwillingness of many of its military to fight. And it was not just the competence of the regime that was being called into question, but the very nature of Russian society. Before the war, revolutionaries had been calling for an end to autocracy and the transformation of Russia into some form of socialist society. But they were deeply divided, small in number, and harried by the authorities. The war increased their support and gave weight to their calls for radical social and political change. Even then, the regime might have hung on in some form, but for the obduracy of the Tsar and the failure of his successors in the provisional government to extract Russia from the war. That provided the opportunity for one of the most hardline, ruthless, and tactically brilliant of the revolutionaries to seize power. Yet if Lenin had remained in exile in Switzerland, where he was when the First February Revolution broke out, he would today be a minor footnote in the history of the 20th century. The German High Command, going for the short-term gain as they did so often, launched him back to Russia across German territory in the famous sealed train. Lenin and his Bolsheviks carried out their coup in November 1917 and established a new order which was to alter the course of Russian and world history. We are still living with the consequences. It is another uncomfortable truth about war that it brings both destruction and creation. So many of our advances in science and technology, the jet engine, transistors, computers, came about because they were needed in wartime. Penicillin, which has saved so many lives, was first discovered in 1928 by Sir Alexander Fleming. But the funds to develop it were not available until the Second World War. The Canadian doctor Norman Bethune pioneered blood transfusions on the battlefield. The practice of triage, now common in emergency rooms and hospitals, started in wars, possibly the Napoleonic. By the First World War, French battlefield doctors were leading the way in the division of the wounded into those whom no treatment would help, those who might live if they were dealt with immediately, and those who could wait surgery for traumatic wounds or to rebuild shattered faces made huge advances during the wars of the 20th century, in part because there were so many patients to practice on. Women in many societies gained access to careers, education, and rights as a result of their participation in war. Even before the end of the First World War, the British government brought in the Representation of the People Act of 1918 to extend the vote to all those who did not own property, which meant the working classes and women over 30, in recognition of their contributions to the war effort. At the end of the Second World War, the introduction of the welfare state was prompted by a similar sentiment during the Cold War. American political leaders, including Presidents Eisenhower and Johnson, accepted that they must do something to provide civil rights for African Americans, not necessarily because they believed in the rightness of the cause. In the long struggle to show which society, the United States or the Soviet Union, was better, the Soviets had a handy weapon for propaganda in American racial discrimination. Recently, prominent historians and economists, among them Walter Scheidel and Thomas Piketty, have argued persuasively that major wars can also act to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor, and that the experience of the nations involved in the First and Second World Wars bears this out. Major wars stimulate employment. Labor becomes more valuable, so wages and benefits go up, and the rich pay higher taxes voluntarily or find it harder to avoid doing so at the end of destructive wars. It is also easier to contemplate major programs of reconstruction and social benefits and gain support for them, as William Beveridge, whose report laid the foundations for the British welfare state. Now, when the war is abolishing landmarks of every kind, is the opportunity for using experience in a clear field. A revolutionary moment in the world's history is a time for revolution, not for patching. There is some evidence, too, that war brings social as well as economic leveling. Men, and sometimes women, are conscripted and thrown together with people unlike any they have ever met before. In the First World War, when young British officers, mostly educated in public schools, censored the letters their men were writing home, they were often surprised to find that ordinary soldiers expressed the same sorts of love, fears, and hopes as they themselves felt. George MacDonald Fraser, later to be famous for his Flashman novels, found himself in the Burma campaign in the Second World War in a regiment largely made up of tough, taciturn working-class Cumbrians. As an educated middle-class boy, he found them fascinating but alien. When his family sent him a couple of books, one a comic novel and the other Henry V, he expected intellectual snob, as he said of himself, that there would be no takers for borrowing the Shakespeare play. When his sergeant, who had left school in his early teens, took it away, Fraser assumed it would remain unread, to his considerable shame, but also his enlightenment. When the sergeant brought the play back 3 days later, he had clearly read it all and been moved by it. Shakespeare must have been in the army, he told Fraser, because he knew so much about what it was to be a soldier. A young middle-class woman in Britain during that war who joined the Women's Royal Naval Service because she thought it had more people of her type than the women's auxiliaries for the Army or Air Force, found herself on a mechanics course with Scottish working-class women. The war, she later admitted, really did a lot of good to girls like me who had been privately educated. It really did. It taught me that working-class people could have emotions and that they could be bright, really bright, because, my goodness, some of those girls were clever. These were things I had simply never considered before. To say that war brings benefits and can help to build stronger, even fairer societies, is not to defend it, of course. We would rather improve our world, help the weak and unfortunate, or have advances in science and technology in a state of peace. Yet finding the will and the resources to make great advances is harder in peacetime. It is all too easy to put off doing something about poverty, the opioid crisis, or climate change. Until another day, war concentrates our attention and, like it or not, has done so throughout human history.